postdoctoral student, yeah. Postdoctoral student at the University of Bergen, social anthropology. And yeah, he is somebody who I'm very happy. He's been part of this for a long time, for quite some time, kind of collecting data, seeing what's going on in this community. And I think he'll have a lot of interesting things to say. So, Will?
I think I've already met quite a few of you. I'm going to need to get this clicker right here. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about whether there are changes in who is signing up for cryonics and in who cryonicists are. So we've been developing this hypothesis, some colleagues and I, called Cryonics 2.0 as part of a research project on different efforts at Radical Life Extension, which is now called the Human Futures Project. Let me click this. Here we go. It's been funded. Actually, need more hands than I have. So it's been funded mostly by Norway's state research fund, and it has staff at the University of Bergen and at Harvard. So Cryonics 2.0 basically refers to a hypothesis about different shifts in how cryonicists self-identify and in how people come to sign up for cryonics, as opposed to earlier trends and understandings of what cryonics was and who cryonicists were. And for the initiated, it has elements of what Yudkowsky called normal cryonics in an earlier blog post, and what Gennady Stolyarov has called implicit transhumanism in his online salon. So here we go. All right, okay. So Cryonics 2.0 basically consists of these two major shifts. One is a changing relationship between cryonics and transhumanism, and the second is what you might call the rationalist turn, or maybe the rise of rationalism, starting with the popularity of rationalist culture online and the further development of effective altruism and long-termism, which roughly apply rationalist principles to altruism and then long-term altruistic goals. The hypothesis here basically suggests that the two shifts are related, but this requires further testing, and I'll make clearer soon how we think they might be related. But the Cryonics 2.0 hypothesis basically comes from some survey data by one of the conference's organizers, Max Marty, which he let me subject to some further statistical analysis, and which I then interpreted using some of the interviews and ethnography we've been conducting in anti-aging and cryonics communities. I spent some time at in-person conferences like these, last year's Teens and 20s, at RadFest, A4M conferences, cryonics board meetings, and at local meetups. But of course, like many of you, I easily spent most of this time in virtual meetings and setups. I say all this not to make a humble brag, but mostly just to sort of express gratitude towards those of you who have already helped me with my research, and also to be a bit transparent about where the sources are of this data. So there's basically two parts to the hypothesis: the mainstreaming and the implicit transhumanism concerns, and the rationalist turn. So I'll take up each separately. Basically, the changing relationships between cryonics and transhumanism might be important on two levels. Most relevant to this conference might be the changing patterns in how cryonicists relate to transhumanism per se, and I'll turn to that data in Max Marty's surveys questions in a moment. But I think the broader context here is also important, and part of that context is how transhumanism has, or seems to have in some ways, gone mainstream, to piggyback on comments by Andrew Sandberg and James Arrowworth earlier. I think this is something like the implicit transhumanism that Gennady has mentioned in some of his previous talks for some years now. And the basic irony here, though, is that even if the number of explicit, self-identified transhumanists amongst cryonicists is both small and maybe even shrinking, and losing out to rationalists and rationalist-adjacent movements, the irony seems to be that many of the ideas that were once specific to transhumanists and other futurists are now thoroughly mainstream. And I don't think this crowd really needs the examples of the contemporary popularizers of deathlessness and chosen lifespans, your Brian Johnsons and Peter Diamanduses, and et cetera. And that's before we even get to the serious research that's being done and presented at some of these conferences. But I think this interest in unlimited lifespan used to be confined perhaps to a much smaller and more distinct group. But with the mass media and major figures who seem to have shown an interest, it also seems to have spread to figures in governance. If you look at the writings of the founder of the World Economic Forum and Young Global Leaders Group, Klaus Schwab, his ideas about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the convergence of the biological and digital have basically made these ideas very popular amongst some policymakers, at least. Nonetheless, many cryonics leaders have increasingly avoided explicitly identifying with transhumanism. I'm thinking of recent interviews with Aubrey de Grey, for instance, where he sort of questions the interviewer's framing about transhumanism and deathlessness, with sort of more moderate language about doing away with the effects of aging. And I don't pretend to understand all these trends, of course, but I wonder whether this is not an attempt sometimes not only to avoid any unnecessary barriers to cryonics, but to sort of ride this mainstreaming wave in a way that doesn't marginalize cryonics. And there are also indications from Max Marty's data that similar lessons may have been learned not just by leaders, but by many older cryonicists as well. And this is where I'll move on a second. Okay, to start, here's one graph from Max Marty's survey that most interests me on identities among cryonicists where respondents can choose multiple identities, including, of course, rationalist, effective altruist, futurist, transhumanist, and life extension enthusiast. So let me direct your attention to the fact that here, while around 49% plus identified with transhumanism, if you combine rationalist and rationalist adjacent, you come out with about 51%, which is, of course, slightly more. And there was a lot of, most survey respondents tended to choose one or the other of those, but there was almost total overlap with effective altruism at 23%. So for readers of older academic studies of cryonics, this might be a little surprising, mostly because, of course, these accounts feature a lot about transhumanism and a little bit less about rationalism and its associated newer movements. So we decided to name this shift Cryonics 2.0, partly to suggest something like this version change in who cryonicists might be. On the other hand, there is some evidence here for a generational shift, but actually the details kind of surprised us when we started to look very closely at it. Before we looked at Marty's data, we took what cryonicists were telling us about rationalism and effective altruism and long-termism, and we suspected that this might break down into a sort of simple generational divide, with younger generations identifying with these rationalist movements and older generations with transhumanists. But actually, the picture was pretty different. It looked like, yes, this graph might suggest that rationalism and its associated movements are growing, but it was actually older cryonicists who were less likely to identify as transhumanists, as well as cryonicists in the countries where English is the main language. Those are the two strongest correlations. So our newest hypothesis for this breakdown, Cryonics 2.0, is that both older cryonicists and cryonics leaders, whether old or young, are quite aware of the baggage and the barriers that the term transhumanism can place in the way of cryonics and other transhumanist goals, especially perhaps in English-speaking contexts. But dropping the label has so far not done much to damage, seemingly, the wave of implicit transhumanism. And it may actually be a small price to pay for the payoff of attracting more people to the goal of radical life extension. So I haven't tested that yet, but that's the goal next. By contrast, when we noticed that younger cryonicists and cryonicists from the non-English speaking countries had adopted the identity of transhumanism as a higher rate, we thought that perhaps the term transhumanism doesn't carry the same baggage in different cultural or linguistic contexts. And I've also seen things by James Hughes, the former head of Humanity Plus, who's argued for something similar about transhumanism in non-Anglophone contexts. So, now I'll show you a couple more tables, which will be even more boring. But I'll draw your attention to the numbers that I think are the most important here. Each row on the left represents different identities that Marty asked about, and on the right, in the last column here, we have age, right? So the middle number in each box is, of course, the statistical significance, and the closer it is to 0, the closer it is to a 0% chance of this correlation is due to chance or random sort of distribution. And of course, if the number on top is negative, that means it is that the older one gets, the less likely one is to associate with that identity. You can see here how when you add together rationalist and rationalist adjacent, as I've done here, you have a, let's say, less than a 0.5% chance that that's, according to just random chance, that it is that there's a negative correlation between identifying as a rationalist and age, meaning the older you are, less likely, right? That might be expected. This is also the case with effective altruism at 0.05, or sorry, not 0.5%. And again, if you look at transhumanism, it's even more extreme. So it is even less likely that older people now identify with transhumanism. Meanwhile, okay, let me see. Sorry. Okay. Okay, in this next slide, basically you see transhumanism in the right here, and you can see that with these last 5 rows minus age, There are different ways that I looked at where people are from in the survey, asking whether they were from the US. These are overlapping categorizations and codings, different ways to ask the question about what matters in terms of where someone is from. Are they from the US? Are they from a country where English is the native language, where the English had a settler colony, or from settler colonies in general? And long story short, the greatest correlation here has to do with English being the native language. So it's sort of what I was arguing earlier about the effect of English-speaking baggage, perhaps associated with transhumanism. So this next set of charts hints at the role of rationalism in Cryonics 2.0. Max Marty asked in the survey a question, where did the respondent first learn about real-world cryonics? Not cryonics in the movies, right? Cryonics as a real-world practice. And what's striking is how often rationalist and rationalist-adjacent websites like Less Wrong and Wait But Why not only led answers as a whole, but specifically amongst younger people, and to a lesser extent, those with college education. So the first slide in this table shows how a multiple regression model based on age and to a lesser extent education can explain between 35 and 50%, the R-square, of the variation amongst respondents as to whether they'd heard about real-world cryonics through these rationalist-associated websites. And the bottom table here basically suggests that only age and to a lesser extent finishing college are statistically significant for this model. So those are the two major variables. If you've heard about cryonics through these websites, it's very likely that you're young amongst these survey respondents, and it's very likely that you either finished college or encountered it in college. It's not clear which. So basically, multiple regression analyses like this are usually used to try to figure out causality. So I'm trying to understand a little bit about what causes someone to at least have heard about cryonics and not to have signed up. So let's see. Okay, so basically the importance of these rationalist on-ramps to cryonics echoes something that Yudkowsky called normal cryonics in an earlier survey post, describing his visit to the Teens and 20s event that was just held here previously. He basically observed that younger cryonicists were increasingly, quote, making a rational bet about the future as opposed to fighting what he called a desperate battle against death. That there was this sort of shift in understanding and self-understanding amongst cryonicists. And I think this shift towards rationalism and mainstream concerns and away from explicit transhumanism is perhaps the most concise distinction between 1.0 cryonics, let's say, and 2.0 cryonics, elaborated in earlier accounts. So I guess lastly, how does this relate to the future of cryonics? I think there are three possibilities worth considering that my research uncovered. I think the first is that the mainstreaming of transhumanist concerns is not guaranteed, of course, and perhaps becomes less likely if there is backlash, right? My first paper was an analysis of Instagram images and hashtag transhumanism sort of images on social media and to see what themes came up. And while this is a fairly primitive method, of course, I can only assume that leading chronicists are already more aware than I am of some of this baggage, and that the muting of explicit transhumanism amongst this older generation is at least partly strategic or considered, representing a sort of prioritization of transhumanist goals over formal transhumanist ideology and language. I think secondly, and relatedly, rationalism, as that name suggests, is a movement that tries to emphasize rationality and the movement's continuity with the scientific and empirical traditions. While transhumanism may feel sometimes like a more radical break in what it means to be human, obviously, by definition, this is not necessarily my view, but I'm just suggesting that perhaps rationalism has certain qualities and connotations that transhumanism doesn't. And that these may act to broaden cryonics' appeal by making it seem, again, like a rational bet or thing to do. Given that, as Ashwin and James said earlier, it's not exactly cost-free in terms of either money or time invested, regardless of the payoff. Right? So in my conversations with Emil and other futurists and chronicists, it became clear there was basically a shifting set of concerns and ways of thinking about cryonics based on the earlier accounts. And of course, it's been some 60 years since the first cryopreservation. So with all the intervening cultural and social development since then. And this brings me to my my third possibility of cryonics spreading not only over time, but space. I think geographic and cultural spaces as well as it goes mainstream. In Europe, of course, we've heard today from Tomorrow, and we also heard from Infeng and Southern Cryonics. And I'd expect, basically, as this spread happens, cryonics will have to address new concerns and new ways of framing it. So perhaps Cryonics 2.0 is just a reflection of this growth itself. You know? I guess these are most of my main findings. I'm still conducting interviews, so if people think they would like to help me better understand these questions and why people may be choosing cryonics, I'd be happy to speak with any of you. I will have my email up here. And generally my goal is to produce a kind of fuller and maybe less sensationalistic account of what cryonics is and who cryonicists are. I'm writing a paper that's coming out next year about cryonics in the family, basically talking about how cryonicists have signed up family members or have tried, and those who want this for others that they love, even if they haven't been able to manage it yet. And I think this is maybe one of the biggest differences I've noticed between accounts of cryonics and the way I've experienced it and getting to know some of you, which is that I think a lot of people I've met are motivated by feelings of great love, both for people that they know and maybe for humanity in general. And I think that certainly hasn't ended up being in a lot of the accounts, and the unfortunate side effect of this has been that it looks like people might be doing it for themselves, rather than for others or for the future of humanity. So please do get in touch, therefore, and if you'd like to help inform my study or produce a more accurate picture of cryonics, I'd be happy to work with you. So thanks again.
Thanks, Will. So we have a couple of questions. Just one quick question from me. What is the most important piece of data that you think we haven't collected, haven't even thought to collect, but probably should be collecting in order to understand what kind of people are actually interested in cryonics that we don't understand right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's two pieces. If you wanted to sign up new people, I think research on these new on-roads is probably the most important. If you wanted to improve the picture of what has changed over time, I think it would be good to at least collect retrospective longitudinal data where I could ask people, did you ever identify as a transhumanist? Did you ever, I'd sort of like to know over time how these identifications might have changed, at least in self-report.
Yes, thank you very much. This is extremely valuable research that you're doing, and I think it resonates with a lot of my observations about who tends to self-identify as a transhumanist. Believe it or not, I'm still considered one of the younger transhumanists in this community, but what has struck me in terms of my observation of the differences is that transhumanism in my generation and younger generations is not really seen as being edgy. It's not really seen as pushing the envelope, and to some extent, younger transhumanists therefore feel more comfortable adopting the label, again, as a generalization. And there are still older transhumanists who believe that transhumanism is the proper term to use, but where I have seen pushback or suggestions that perhaps transhumanists should market themselves as something other would be from some of the older transhumanists. And I think what explains it is the following. When they were younger, transhumanism really was edgy. It really was highly controversial. They were pushing the envelope, and they were experiencing extreme pushback. Some of them were maligned to a great extent, and I think they want a respite from that. And they think that by utilizing different cultural signaling, they might elicit more acceptance from what they consider to be prestigious institutions. For people in younger generations, those so-called prestigious institutions have increasingly shown to be hollow and kind of discredited, so we don't care as much. We might as well use that label. At the same time, we are a bit more pragmatic about how we approach transhumanism as well. But I think the survey data bear out what I've observed just in my everyday interactions.
That's helpful. Thank you. Absolutely. Wow.
I had my own personal observation. I noticed that I think that younger cryonicists do tend to come from less wrong in rationality, but cryonicists my age or older tend to come from the libertarian school of thought, the radical anarchist school of thought, which I kind of identified with at a younger age. So in early cryonics, there was a lot of legal challenges and you really had to fight society. So it makes sense that these radical activists would come in and be interested in promoting cryonics. So is this something that you've studied or found anything to that effect?
So yeah, I didn't talk about it here, but I do think there's a political shift happening. And James Hughes, former president of the World Transhumanist Association, let me do some further coding of some of his earlier political data. And yes, I think that a lot of there's some continuities and there's some shifts that have happened in the politics, but it really matters how you think about libertarianism is what I found. So when I coded it a couple different ways, it mattered, like, yes, yeah, so interesting, yeah.
So the pattern that stands out to me, having lived through this, is just that futurism in general has gone through these waves of different communities and names, and these are just the last two waves of futurism. Before that, there's environmentalism and 60s, 50s science fiction, et cetera, all the way back. So the simple theory that stands out to me is the key thing is cryonics people tend to come from people who are thinking about the future, and then whatever generation was their futurism, that's the people it comes from.
No, I think you're right. I think futurism is probably the biggest frame, Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, one very quick one left.
I have a couple methodological questions. I know you said you use both surveys and interviews. Were they semi-structured interviews, or what type of interview methodology did you use, and how many respondents were you able to recruit?
So far, I've interviewed, I think, 24 people in a semi-structured interview style. There's about 14 questions that I'm trying to get to, but it's normally like a life history approach. I want to know how people got to know about cryonics, and hear a little bit retrospectively about how they came to it, and then how it relates to their relationships with other people in their life. Those are the ideas.
All right, thank you, Will. All right, so Katie, are we okay if we start? Do we have to start like in 2 minutes, 5 minutes? What? We have 5 minutes. We have a little bit of time. Oh, okay, good. Okay, yeah. So we have a few minutes. So if anybody has any more questions for Will, we can do that. Yeah. Just want to make sure we're not running out of time, but we're okay. Okay, we're good. Okay, we'll hit you up with one more, Will.
Okay, so I'm curious about some conclusions you might have drawn. So there was a libertarian advocacy group years ago, Advocates for Self-Government, that had a phrase, the libertarian macho flash, where people would try to convince someone of an idea by mentioning something that was really confrontational, as if that will be convincing. So I'm kind of curious, based on what you've learned, are there things that we can do that we think will present cryonics ideas or potentially convince someone that we should never do, that just are horrible to all the groups and turns people away or things like that? Have you learned what not to do from this research?
That's a really good question. So I will say this is not like new information, and maybe this is the oldest and most boring thing I could say, but I do think the bias to not think about death and mortality is pretty strong. So I think if you could present like the idea of like, would you do something that means that in the future people could heal you and rejuvenate you and you could continue to live without going maybe into the details, because the details have a bit of an ick factor, I think, that's unavoidable for a lot of people. And the alternative is not thinking about burial or cremation. The alternative is not thinking about it at all. So I think, maybe that's sort of boring, but I do think that, if you could present these, yeah, no intense carotid. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more? No? Okay.